Thank you, Jeff. I remember that visit. That was inspiring to me too. And good morning, Kwame. Good morning, everyone. I'm so honored to be here celebrating the mission and the launch of the William Julius Wilson Institute. Happy to be in the presence of so many of you who are improving communities all over the country. There's really nothing that makes me feel more hopeful than meeting people in community who are working hard and making progress. And Jeff, we're just so grateful for your leadership and passion in all that you do. Grateful for the team of talented people you've gathered to join you at the Institute. And I promise you this, bringing the Institute to life is going to be so much more fun than retirement. I promise. So Jeff and the work of HCZ helped me understand that community is the agent of change. Neighborhoods and communities can and must heal themselves, but how to do this at scale and with urgency. And Jeff has said to us all, we need to advance from work that impacts hundreds of children to work that impacts hundreds of thousands of children. And so that's really what today's gathering is about. That's what we're all trying to do here together. Jeff's work really contributed to Steve and my decision to focus a significant amount of our philanthropy on highly rigorous and impactful place-based partnerships. We've had the great opportunity to visit many partnerships in the Strive Together and Community Solutions networks, really inspiring local leaders, bringing communities together through a backbone organization, facilitating many sectors and programs to link arms and make progress on priority outcomes. And when partners hold each other accountable and we can get multiple players moving in the same direction, we do see results for kids and families. Results like a 60% improvement in early grade reading in Spartanburg elementary schools, and 14 communities that have completely eliminated veteran and or chronic homelessness. And central to all of this is data. Real-time numbers that accurately describe the problem, as well as revealing which solutions are working or not. So data tells us which neighborhoods and communities most need attention and investment. So, data is central. And speaking of data, I have the good fortune to introduce Dr. Raj Chetty this morning. Dr. Chetty is an incredible force for good. He showed us that inequities do determine the fate of Americans. By translating millions of data points into clear and interesting visualizations, Dr. Chetty proves that place matters. And he fueled conversations on how to address poverty and unlock economic mobility. And while his data sets may tell us that the American dream may be fading, his determination to revive it is most inspirational to me. Like Jeff Canada, Dr. Chetty's work has been a powerful influence on our philanthropy. So Steve and I founded Ballmer Group around the same time that Dr. Chetty's groundbreaking study on economic mobility was released in 2015. Yeah, that study that everybody was reading and talking about. And it opened our eyes to many things, but most specifically that African-American men are among those least likely to see economic mobility in their lifetime. His research prompted many passionate discussions in our office and inspired our grant making to recruit more Black teachers, reform juvenile justice systems, and improve community safety in Black and brown neighborhoods. And we wanted to double down to support local leaders in place. So as a supporter and admirer of Dr. Chetty's work, I believe there's probably nobody better to help us understand the challenges of communities, as well as the promise of solutions. So a few things we should all be reminded about Raj. He is the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he received his PhD in 2003. He is the founder and director of Opportunity Insights, and he's a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Fellowship and the 2013 John Bates Clark Medal, which is given to the best American economist under age 40. His current research focuses on the equality of opportunity. How do we give children from disadvantaged backgrounds better chances of succeeding? Because Chetty's research combines empirical evidence and economic theory to help with more effective government policy, we are delighted that he's going to be an advisor to President-elect Joe Biden, using data to guide policy and carve a path forward. So welcome, Raj. So glad you're here with us today.
Thank you so much, Connie, for the very warm introduction. It's a real privilege and honor to be here with all of you today. I'm tremendously inspired by the work of Jeff Canada, by the work of this incredible institute that's being launched, and by all of you. So I see my job here today as trying to provide some of the evidence backbone for really the efforts that all of you are undertaking in communities around the United States. Why does it make sense to focus on place as the key tool to restore the American dream? And so what I'm going to do is share a set of slides reviewing some findings from our recent research, some of which you might be familiar with, and give you a sense of how things are changing in the COVID crisis and where we're looking going forward, hopefully some insights that will be helpful in shaping your efforts in the future. So I'm going to share some slides here. Hopefully we're seeing these slides on the screen. Just to dive in, I want to focus here on the power of place, and in particular by place, I mean at the very granular level, the block in which you grow up as potentially determining your outcomes in adulthood. But I want to first situate that conversation by zooming out and talking about the American dream in a historical context with this chart here, which shows you a very simple measure of whether kids in America really have a shot at achieving the American dream, kind of as laid out in the principles that Jeff was talking about in his introductory remarks. And so one way that the American dream has historically been conceptualized is that this is a country where through hard work, anyone should have the chance of rising up in the income distribution relative to their parents. And so my colleagues and I set about to ask this simple question: is it actually true that in America, most kids go on to have a higher standard of living than their parents did? And so what we did is, by putting together a bunch of different data sets, calculated the fraction of kids who went on to earn more than their parents did, adjusting for inflation, measuring that statistic based on the year in which kids were born. And so what you can see here is, if you look back at kids born in the 1940s and 1950s, the middle of the last century, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream. 92% of kids born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time on your screen, you see a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for kids who are turning 30 today, when we're measuring their earnings, born in the mid-1980s, it's now only a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents did. These trends are particularly acute for disadvantaged groups, for certain minorities in certain parts of the country. And I think this broad trend is what is underlying a lot of the frustration that people are expressing across the US, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead. And so, motivated by this dramatic trend, in our research and policy group at Harvard Opportunity Insights, we have been focused on trying to understand, as Connie put it, that's disillusioning data. How can you restore the American dream? How can we reverse that trend? And our angle for doing that is to take advantage of the moment we're in a different way. You all hear a lot about information technology and big data, companies like Google and Amazon using large data sets to improve the products they offer. Our vision is that type of data, that type of information can perhaps help us address important social and economic policy questions, like how can we restore the American dream? And so what we do is analyze a broad range of interventions from childhood to adulthood. And where this has led us as a starting point is to look at the very sharp local differences in rates of upward mobility which it turns out I think are really critical for understanding how we change the national picture. And so to dive into that data, I want to show you this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So what we're doing here is taking about 20 million kids using data from anonymized tax returns, kids born in the early 1980s. We're linking them to their information on their parents, and we're asking how well do they do as adults when they're 35 years old? How much are they earning based on where they grew up, conditional on growing up in a low-income family. So we take a set of kids who specifically are growing up in families at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, that is families earning about $27,000 a year. And we ask, what are these kids who grow up in relatively low income families, how much are they earning as adults? And the map is colored so that blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. So if you look, for instance, at Dubuque, Iowa, kids growing up in low-income families there, on average, are earning $45,000 a year as adults, so a substantial amount of upward mobility across just one generation. But then if you look in contrast at Charlotte, North Carolina, you're seeing average incomes in adulthood for kids who are growing up in families at the same level of income of only $26,000 a year, essentially no progress across generations, which might be particularly surprising to you for those of you who know Charlotte, because Charlotte's a booming economy, kind of the engine of jobs in the South. Despite that, we have huge swaths of kids who are being left out of that progress in terms of economic opportunity. So after we discovered this very large variation across areas in the United States, the natural question for us became, what is it that's making kids have better chances of rising up in places like the rural Midwest or the Bay Area and San Francisco? And why are opportunities to rise up poorer in places like Charlotte? And can we use that information to unlock how we might increase opportunity throughout the United States? And so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is share some of the lessons that we have learned over the past few years, and there's more remaining to be learned, on what I think really is driving these differences. So I'm going to focus here principally on the role of place and the role of neighborhoods as being a key factor in driving rates of upward mobility. But I would be remiss not to mention the equally important role of race and racial disparities at this moment in particular in driving differences in upward mobility. And so before I turn to zoom into local neighborhoods, I first want to show you the map that I just put up, breaking the data down separately for Black men on the left and white men on the right. So we're looking at exactly the same data. What are your chances? What are your outcomes in adulthood? How much are you earning as an adult, conditional on growing up in a low-income family, for Black men on the left and white men on the right? Now, when you first look at this map, when I first saw these maps, I thought, okay, it looks like we've put these maps on two different color scales, right? Like a red-yellow color scale on the left and a blue-green color scale on the right. But if you look at the bottom of the slide, in fact, we have not. The maps are on the same color scale. It's just that there are essentially two Americas. There's such a stark racial divide in the United States, even today, that your prospects for upward mobility just look dramatically different for Black men and white men. In particular, the best places for Black men, a place like Boston, for example, you see lower levels of earnings for Black men in Boston than you do in the places with the lowest levels of upward mobility, a place like Charlotte for white men. And so, yesterday I was looking back at some of Dr. King's speeches, and he spoke of two Americas and the fundamental importance of race in the United States. And unfortunately, I think that very much remains the case, despite the progress that's been made, despite the many efforts we've all undertaken. Race still plays a fundamental role in driving these disparities. Now, I just showed you the data here for Black men and white men. I want to also show you the same pair of maps for Black women and white women. And here you see a very different pattern, which is, look at the spectrum of colors on the two maps. They tend to be relatively similar across the two maps. So rates of upward mobility for Black and white women actually are not that different from each other. And so there's something in particular about the challenges that Black men face in rising up in the United States that I think we need to be very deliberate about addressing. So coming back now to the role of place, I want to go back to this map, which shows you the data for everyone, pooling Black Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans, and so forth. And I want to then ask, okay, so what is it? We've seen that race plays some role in driving these differences, but place still matters tremendously. Even among white folks, there are really big differences in opportunity across areas. So what is it that's driving that? And so to dig deeper, what we did next is looked at the data not just across regions, as you're seeing here, but zoomed in to look at the data by census tract, by neighborhood, across zip codes, and so forth. And so to illustrate that, I'm going to toggle over here to this tool called the Opportunity Atlas, which you can access yourself on the web if you want to look up data on your own neighborhoods in your own city, opportunityatlas.org. And I'm going to enter in an address, 539 Sutter Avenue in Brooklyn, and we're going to zoom in there. And we're looking at the same type of statistics on upward mobility that I was talking about earlier. And so here now we're looking at the data in detail, neighborhood by neighborhood in New York City. And so the first thing I want you to see is that the range of colors you're seeing on your screen is the same as what you were seeing in the national maps, right? You go from the darkest reds to the deepest blues. And what that's telling you is you can go 2 miles down the street in New York City, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So that's the first illustration that the drivers of economic opportunity are incredibly local. It's not about differences across states or differences across even cities. It's about differences across blocks within a given city. And so to give you one particular illustration of that, I'm going to focus here. What you can do with these data is not just look at the data for everyone. You can look at the data for different subgroups. I'm going to look at the data for Black men in particular, the group that I was just focused on before, and zoom in to this address in New York, 539 Sutter Avenue, which it turns out is called the Van Dyke Public Housing Projects, one of the biggest public housing projects in the Brownsville area of New York, which some of you might know. And what's interesting about this example is if you look on this side of the street, north of Dumont Avenue here in Brownsville, you see a very dark red color in the Van Dyke housing projects. Black men who grow up there have average incomes in adulthood of only $16,000 a year. In contrast, if you just go south of that street to a place called the Nehemiah Houses, a mixed income housing development that was developed in the 1980s, that number jumps up to 28,000, literally on the other side of the street. So that illustrates the hyper-local differences that we see here and elsewhere throughout the United States. You can enter whatever address you like, you'll find similar patterns. So now, motivated by that example, I want to come back here to the slides and show you why place really matters by giving you an example and asking you to think about a set of people who move from, say, the Van Dyke houses, which we just saw has relatively low rates of upward mobility for kids who grow up there from birth. Say they have average incomes of $17,000 a year as adults. And think about kids who move to the Nehemiah houses just south of Dumont Avenue. And what we did in one of our studies is tracked several million families that made moves like this, not just from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses, but across neighborhoods across the United States. And we asked what happened when you moved to a place that was more in a blue-green color. What happened to your own prospects? And what you can see when you look at these data, I'm going to first show you this dot here, which shows you what happens to kids who move when they're exactly 2 years old, in this example from Van Dyke to Nehemiah. When we track these kids forward 30 years and look at their incomes as adults, we see that they have average earnings of about $25,000 a year. So that's for kids who move when they're exactly 2. Now we repeat that analysis for kids who move when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on. And what you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make that move to a higher mobility area, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship is completely flat and you get no further gain. So why is this chart important? It shows you that where you grow up really has a fundamental effect on your life outcomes. And in particular, if you spend more years growing up in a better neighborhood, you are going to have better outcomes as an adult, a better shot of achieving the American dream. So place really matters at a fundamental hyperlocal way. So next step in this, naturally, the question to ask is, what is it that's leading to better outcomes in some of these places that I showed you, Dubuque, Iowa, or south of Dumont Avenue in Brooklyn? And what is it that's leading to lower levels of upward mobility in others? So this is really the core of our research agenda at present. We have looked at a variety of different factors that predict these differences in upward mobility. And I'm just listing some of the strongest predictors here. Places with lower poverty rates, so mixed income areas, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Places with more stable family structures, so a larger share of two-parent families, turns out to be a strong predictor of differences in upward mobility. As you might expect intuitively, very consistent with the Harlem Children's Zone, places with better schools tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. And then finally, places with greater social capital. So I think of social capital as the cohesiveness of a community. Will someone else help you out even if you're not doing well? And it turns out this is kind of a difficult thing to measure, but my sense is an extremely important factor in driving differences in upward mobility. And the next study that we're going to be releasing from Opportunity Insights later this year in a few months is going to be focused on social capital as a determinant of upward mobility, using data from social networks on billions of friendships across the United States. And what we're finding, just to give you a sneak preview, is that the extent to which people are connected to each other is really a core determinant of differences in upward mobility, and I think might be one of the key ingredients to the success of things like the Harlem Children's Zone, where it's more than just changing schools, it's about an entire community coming together to try to produce different outcomes. I want to make one final point here and then wrap up. In the work that you all do, and when I think about these issues, people often ask me, you say neighborhoods are important. What exactly do you mean by a neighborhood? How big is a neighborhood? Is it like the city that I live in? Is it the zip code? Is it my block? And so we can analyze that again with these types of modern data. And so the way we do that, I'm going to illustrate in this chart here, is I just told you earlier that lower poverty rates are associated with higher rates of upward mobility. So if you live in a block with a lower poverty rate, it's associated with higher rates of upward mobility. What I want to do now is an analysis where I look at what the effect of lower poverty rates is in a block that's one away from you. That's the second dot here. And you can see that it has 60% as large an effect as the poverty rate in your own block. Now let's repeat that analysis, looking at the next block over, the block after that, the block after that. And what you see is this incredibly sharp decay, such that poverty rates that are more than, say, half a mile away from your house essentially have no predictive power for your outcomes. And so what this analysis is showing you is that place matters in an incredibly local way. What basically matters are conditions in a half-mile radius around your house. Once I tell you about those conditions, telling you about what's happening beyond that radius doesn't really have that much predictive power. And so when we think about restoring the American dream, the grand national challenge that we face, it looks like the answer lies actually at a very local level, at a half-mile level across the United States. And that's why I think you have to think about things like the Harlem Children's Zone in order to address national problems. I want to wrap up by recognizing the moment we're in. We're doing this on Zoom in the midst of a pandemic. How does all this change in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? And I want to share a bit of data that we've been tracking on that front before I conclude. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, as you all know, and as Jeff mentioned, there have been incredibly disparate impacts across different people in the country. So here, what we did at Opportunity Insights when the pandemic struck is we thought, how can we use our tools to try to produce as much real-time data as possible so people can understand how the crisis is affecting different places, different people, and so forth. And so we started to work with many private companies to track things like employment, spending, and so forth day by day across the country. And so what you're seeing here first is when you look at employment rates, you see that there's been a dramatic loss of jobs for people in the bottom wage quartile. People making less than $13 an hour fell very sharply when the pandemic hit, and by April 15th was down 40%, 12 million jobs lost. For high-income folks, you see a very rapid V-shaped recovery so that they're basically back to baseline levels of employment within a few weeks. But for low-income folks, you're still down about 6 million jobs. Now, why do I bring this up here? It's another example of disparities being exacerbated here by this health shock. It turns out, again, that place is incredibly important. And the reason place is important here is that, again, I'm going to now show you data for New York City as an example. The reason a lot of people lost their job is that lots of people basically started to self-isolate and not go out and go to restaurants, go to local shops, and so forth. And so if you look at the revenues of small businesses located in different parts of New York, you can see that in the most affluent parts of New York, for instance, around Central Park, small businesses located there, tracking data from credit cards, lost more than 73% of their revenue. They essentially lost their entire business. But if you go up to the Bronx or other parts of the Queens, you see that businesses there lost more like 30% of their revenue, significantly less. So there are really sharp differences by place. Now, who bears the consequence of that? Turns out if you look at low-wage workers, if you happen to be working around Central Park and the Upper East Side and so forth, you had a 60 or 70% chance of losing your job as a worker in the service sector, for example. But if you happen to be working up in the Bronx or parts of the Queens, you had more like a 20% chance of losing your job. And so again, we see these incredibly disparate impacts across nearby places. Once again, showing how I think this pandemic is going to have really disproportionate impacts on low-income folks in particular parts of the country. So once again, I think recovery is going to have to be place-based. One last result: how is the pandemic going to affect economic opportunities going forward? One piece of data that we've been tracking to look at that is how kids are doing in school as schools went remote in mid-March. We're tracking data from a platform called Zern, which about 1 million students use in the US to learn math as part of their regular school curriculum. And you can see here that there have been enormous disparities that opened up. Kids in low-income families are now learning much less math after the pandemic hit relative to before. And so I worry that the differences in opportunity that we already started out with are going to be even further exacerbated coming out of the pandemic, which makes the work of this group all the more important. So let me conclude by thanking all of you for the work you're doing in the field to make a difference on these issues. And I hope these data, which you can access freely on this website, and the research that we're doing will help support these efforts going forward. Thanks very much.